Welcome to episode 8 of Project Stresa, a timeline which starts at the point of divergence of Austria being admitted into Germany in 1919. The Soviet Southern thrust has put pressure on the Saxon allies in ways that exceeded their greatest expectations. The Japanese managed to dominate China's coastline as Chiang's Kuomintang capitulates to the reorganized government of China. The Russian Fascist Party gains ground against the Soviets, and the Japanese managed to secure nearly all of America's naval bases in the Pacific. The British Army in Egypt has been reinforced by Rommel in response to the Soviet southern thrust, with the Saxon Allied High Command's goal of weakening the American advance into Egypt. However, while the grand battle is going on between the legendary generals in Africa, the British Empire was in crisis. In this episode, we will be focusing on the events that led to the United Kingdom and the British Empire's greatest test. After the Americans had occupied Canada, many within the US government were wondering what to do with it. Many saw the occupation of Canada as the victory that 1812 had meant to be, praised Wallace for his daring, and eagerly encouraged him to annex Canada outright. However, the Canadian withdrawal had been a calculated move, and while they were stalling the Americans' advance, the Canadians were installing resistance cells to perform guerrilla warfare against the Americans. For this reason, any attempt for the Americans to outright annex Canada would only hamper the war effort. In order to bring Canada into the fold, they had to delegitimize the resistance movement. In order to do so, they would establish ties with potential collaborators. The first and most obvious decision would be to establish a free Quebec. Ever since the 7 Years' War, the French-majority region of Canada had several attempts for freedom or resistance against the British and Canadian rule. With the advent of the American occupation of Quebec, the possibility for a truly free Quebec was finally possible. Many Quebecois nationalists would eagerly collaborate with the American occupiers, hoping that America would listen to their plight and grant Quebec independence. While this was certainly compelling, there was also the potential of the Canadian puppet state to consider. If the Americans were to create a Quebecois republic, the Canadian people would see the Canadian puppet government as illegitimate. Then there is the question of who would lead the Canadian government, and what kind of government it would have. Since Canada was a dominion of the United Kingdom and a part of the British Empire, it was a monarchy, with a single line of legitimate heirs, the Windsors. Any attempt for the Americans to create a Canadian republic would be a farce, and defeat the purpose of the concept of a puppet government in the first place. You may as well annex the entire of Canada as territories. So, if there were to be a Canadian collaboration government, it would need a monarch. Where could the Americans find a claimant to the throne of Britain who's comfortable fighting on the side of fascists and is close by? Well, you'll never guess who the Americans found after they invaded the British Bahamas: the former King of Britain, Edward VIII. The infamous King Edward became King of Britain after his father's death in 1936. However, he would abdicate that same year after refusing to divorce his to-be wife, the twice divorcee Wallis Simpson. After his abdication, he had only fallen into more scandal as he showed interest in Nazi Germany. In order to neutralize the threat of his rival claimancy and sympathies with fascism, he was declared the governor of the Bahamas and was promptly sent there during the Second World War. In this timeline, the story is the same, up until the Americans seized the Bahamas anyhow. Once the Americans had Edward in their custody, they gave him an offer that he couldn't refuse: become the new head of Canada and claim his rightful place as the King of the United Kingdom, sovereign of the British Empire. Edward would accept this deal. This rival government had, upon request of the Americans, granted the Quebecois independence, and leased the Canadian provinces east of Quebec to the Americans, which should be used as naval bases for their next move against the Saxon allies. In order to legitimize the Edwardian government as a British imperial effort, and not simply a Canadian puppet government, Oswald Mosley was appointed Prime Minister by King Edward under a provisional government. While the provinces of Canada would elect their officials to Parliament, as they had done previously, the Prime Minister and his cabinet would not be debated. After Wallace had recognized the Edwardian government as the true government of Britain, The American government had once again gotten their hands dirty by working with fascists. However, this time it was not simply a result of conflicting alliances. This time, it was deliberate. The American government had been selling this Atlantic War to the people of America as a war to end British imperialism. Now, the Americans were sponsoring it, with a fascist at the head of their government, no less. The Americans had pressured Edward into issuing a proclamation in order to attempt to diminish the scandal. This proclamation had guaranteed to the Canadian and American peoples that once he would return to Britain proper, he would give the Canadians the freedom to decide their fate via referendum. This, of course, did not include the rest of Britain's dominions or colonies, and was quickly revealed to be an empty promise, only fulfilling the desires of the American nationalists who sought to unite the Anglo-Saxons of America under one state. America had only become more divided. The socialist anti-war unions grew as disdain for the Democratic Party had risen. Wallace began adopting more and more fascist policies in his attempts to expand the New Deal program. While the New Deal in our history and in this timeline up until this point was not fascistic, it inevitably gained more of a fascistic flavor in this timeline. These temporary corporatist policies led to small business owners losing their freedoms and wealth, moving more and more to the Republican Party, who advocated for the free market to be restored. However, this would play to the Republican Party's detriment, as the socialists who were supporting Dewey under a united front in order to end the war in the Atlantic began to struggle with the fact that Dewey was pandering to the petite bourgeoisie. The election continued to loom, and America's fate lay in the balance. It was no longer simply an election to preserve democracy in Europe. It was an election to preserve democracy in America. A major thorn in the side of the Americans in their war effort was their naval capabilities of safely reaching the British Isles. As mentioned before, the Americans may have been able to send a large naval invasion to Britain from their homeland, but any action that they would take at this stage would be far too risky. Even the Americans' attempts to aid the Soviets with their logistical issues via Lend-Lease had been consistently thwarted by German U-boats blocking shipments. With the British being comfortably seated right between the Americans and their shipping route to the Soviets, German U-boats did not need to go far in order to utterly destroy any hope for the Soviets to gain American aid. In order to put more pressure on the British, and properly hunt down the submarines that were raiding the American convoys, the Americans needed naval bases. The neutral country of Denmark had Iceland and Greenland under their purview. These colonies were in the perfect position to station American ships in an aggressive and defensive manner. The USA promptly demanded that the Danish concede these territories to them. Once the Danish refused, the USA promptly declared war and quickly seized Greenland. Denmark was quickly brought into the Saxon allies, and Iceland was heavily fortified by the British. With the Americans slowly closing in on the British position, they needed supplies and their Pacific Navy to come and defend the home isles. Much to the dismay of the Japanese, the British Navy began the long trek home, refueling at the Cape before traversing the Atlantic. With the seizure of Greenland and the looming American advance into Iceland, the home islands are increasingly under threat of an American invasion. Fearing American ambitions on their land, and out of brotherhood in defending their kin, the remaining Scandinavian nations of Norway, Finland, and even Sweden all joined the Saxon allies. With their strong ties to the British and each other, the nations of Scandinavia banded together against the USA and the Soviets, fearing their partition once the American Navy came knocking on the coasts of Norway, or the Soviets began demanding their subjugation. While the Saxon-allied Soviet front line benefited from the inclusion of the Scandinavian states into their alliance, and their strategic position helped continue to disrupt American-Soviet shipping, their meager navies were unable to assist the Atlantic front in a way that would turn the tide. With the Edwardian rival government gaining more legitimacy, the Latin Axis were able to sow seeds of doubt within the British public against their government. Would the British be able to stand up against the Americans? Will the Japanese manage to continue to press their advantage even without British naval support? How will the British colonies react to Britain's signs of weakness? All these questions and more will be answered in episode 9 of Project Stresa, where the war spreads to Latin America.